They came with cuffs, sirens, and smug smiles, ready to arrest a disabled woman for defying an HOA she never even joined. But as they stepped onto her porch, something shifted. The K-9 unit paused. Tension thickened. Because what they didn't know, she trained them, and they remembered. After decades of loyal service as a K-9 officer, my mother finally settled into what was supposed to be a quiet retirement. A modest home on a peaceful street, no drama, no noise, just her service dog, and the freedom she'd earned. But peace is a luxury not everyone respects. Without warning, letters began appearing, demands for dues, citations for non-existent violations. The kicker? She was never part of their HOA. No paperwork, no signed agreement, just a newly self-appointed HOA president who decided that power gave her permission. My mom politely refused. That's when things took a dark turn. First, her trash mysteriously wasn't picked up. Then her wheelchair ramp was reported as unauthorized construction. And finally, they chained her gate shut, trapping her in her own home. 3 days later, the police showed up, but they weren't ready for what they'd walked into. Because arresting her? That was their biggest mistake. It started with a note, taped crudely to the front door. No envelope, no name, just a demand, $175 in overdue HOA fees and a threat of legal action. My mother, confused, called the number listed. No answer. She went through her home documents, lease, and county records. Nothing. No agreement, no mention of any HOA. She hadn't signed up for anything. But the notes kept coming. Within a week, they escalated. First came the complaint about her wheelchair ramp, obstructing the uniformity of the neighborhood aesthetic. It had been professionally installed, approved by the city and legally required. Didn't matter. The notice said it had to be removed within 10 days or she'd be fined $500 per day. Then they came for her dog. Ranger, her retired K-9 partner, was more than a pet. He was her medical alert dog, a protector, and her last working partner from the force. But the HOA claimed he was a nuisance animal, said his barking was disturbing neighbors, even though he rarely barked at all. They slapped her with a warning, followed by a $200 fine. That's when Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, sunglasses, perfectly coiffed blonde bob, and that smug, predatory smile. She started showing up like clockwork, right around 8 a.m., stood at the edge of the property line, pretending to inspect landscaping while taking photos of my mother's house. She snapped shots of the mailbox, the front porch, the curtains, even the dog's water bowl. Once she leaned over the fence and shouted at my mom for leaving unsightly items on the porch, a folded wheelchair and a bag of dog food. My mother remained calm, stoic even. Years in the force had trained her for worse, but I could see the wear. I could hear it in her voice when she called, quietly asking if I could stop by, just in case they try something. I did, and what I saw made my blood boil. Karen wasn't acting alone. 2 other board members, people I'd never seen at any official meeting, because there were no official meetings, were pacing along the sidewalk, whispering to each other and pointing at my mother's yard. One of them had a tape measure. I watched from behind a curtain as he knelt beside a property marker and started fiddling with it, trying to shift it inward. I stepped out with my phone filming. He froze, blinked, and stood up with a fake smile. Oh, just checking easement boundaries. I asked him what authority he had to do that on private property. He had no answer, just walked away. Days later, a letter came in the mail, typed on an official-looking letterhead from the so-called HOA compliance office. It accused my mom of encroaching on common property lines. They wanted her to remove her fence, repaint the porch to match community color standards, and pay $1,150 in outstanding fines, all within 7 days. We requested documentation, legal proof, boundaries, membership agreements, anything. Nothing came. But the threats didn't stop. Instead, they escalated again. Anonymous complaints were filed with the city code office. Each one false. Unpermitted structures, unsanitary living conditions, illegal modifications. Each one dismissed after inspection. But each visit rattled my mom just a little more. She wasn't used to being the one questioned. Then came the police report, filed by Karen herself. She claimed my mom had verbally threatened her with violence during one of her property inspections. Claimed she feared for her safety. A patrol car showed up one evening, lights off, knocking on the door just after dark. The officer, visibly uncomfortable, asked a few questions, realized it was nonsense, and left. But the damage was done. There was now a complaint with her name on it. And finally, they crossed the line. One morning, my mother called me in tears, not from fear, but from sheer frustration. She'd gone out to get the paper and found the gate chained shut. Not with a lock she owned. Someone had sealed her inside her own yard. She was in a wheelchair. Her dog couldn't break it. She was trapped until a neighbor noticed and helped cut the chain. I knew then this wasn't incompetence. It wasn't confusion. It was war. A coordinated, calculated campaign of harassment to force her into paying dues to an organization she never signed up for. And when intimidation didn't work, they tried to paint her as unstable, as the problem, as the threat. But what they forgot, what Karen and her clipboard gang never realized, was who they were dealing with. She wasn't just some quiet old woman in a wheelchair. She was a former officer, a decorated handler, a woman who trained law enforcement to detect lies, threats, and patterns. And every move they made, she documented it, time-stamped it, built a case. Because while they were watching her front yard, she was building her defense. And she wasn't planning on using words to end this. She was bringing the K-9 unit. And they weren't coming with questions. The morning the arrest warrant arrived, the air felt wrong. Not the kind of wrong you can explain, just a weight pressing down. My mother called me before sunrise, calm, controlled. That same tone she used during emergency calls back in the day. "They're coming," she said. And they were. By 9 a.m., the sound of engines rolled up the street, black SUVs, low and deliberate. Not the usual cruisers. Not some patrol car on a courtesy check. These were units with purpose. My stomach dropped. They had actually followed through. The HOA, in their arrogance, had filed formal charges. Falsified claims, obstruction, threats, violations. All lies, stacked high enough to convince a small-town magistrate to issue a warrant. They'd painted her as unhinged, aggressive, dangerous, and now she was about to be arrested on her own front porch. But that's where the story changed. As the vehicles pulled up, my mom wheeled herself outside and sat quietly by her ramp. Ranger, her K-9 partner, stood at her side, ears alert but calm. No fear, no panic, just presence. The first officer out of the vehicle paused when he saw her. He wasn't just some stranger in a badge. He was one of hers, Officer Daniels. She'd trained him from rookie status through his K-9 certification. He'd been to her retirement ceremony. She'd attended his promotion. Behind him, two more officers stepped out, each with a working dog at their side. Dogs she knew, dogs she had trained, partners she had worked with. One of them, Tank, had been her last active duty assignment before she retired. The silence was thick. Not hostile, not friendly, just tense. She looked Daniels in the eye and said, steady as ever, "Are you really here to arrest me or arrest them?" He didn't blink, just stared for a long moment, then let out a breath and said, "Ma'am, we're here on your side." That's when everything snapped into place. Turns out Daniels had already been suspicious. The reports filed against her didn't add up. The timeline was inconsistent, and her record was too clean, too decorated for the story the HOA tried to spin. So he dug deeper, pulled phone logs, cross-referenced reports, contacted county records, and that's when he found it. There was no legal HOA. The original development had dissolved the association over a decade ago after a class action lawsuit. No current filing, no tax ID, no legal authority. But Karen and her inner circle had revived the name, forged documents, and had been extorting residents, mostly the elderly and isolated, for months. And my mother? She was the one they couldn't intimidate. Daniels had gone straight to the sheriff, his and my mother's former commanding officer, and laid out everything. In the background, an internal investigation was launched, quietly, carefully, because if they acted too soon, Karen might vanish, along with the money. So they waited, watched, built their case, and now they were ready. Daniels turned, gave a subtle nod, and within seconds the other officers fanned out. Not toward my mother, but toward Karen's house across the street. Two of them headed to the fake HOA's makeshift office, just a rented garage down the block. Warrants in hand. Karen came storming out of her house in full fury, arms waving, screaming that the police were there for the criminal, that they were wasting time. But this time no one was listening. One of the officers calmly read her rights as she was handcuffed on the sidewalk. Her face twisted in disbelief. Not fear, not regret, just outrage that the system she'd used to bully others had turned on her. As she was led to the vehicle, she locked eyes with my mother. No words, just that final, bitter realization. She'd lost, and not to some fragile retiree, but to the woman she had underestimated. The woman who had spent decades training the very team that came to bring justice. In the hours that followed, everything unraveled. Officers recovered bank records, forged documents, and hidden audio recordings of HOA meetings that weren't meetings at all, just planning sessions for how to target certain neighbors. The fraud extended to over a dozen residents, tens of thousands of dollars in fake fines, all under the radar. But it was my mom's refusal, her persistence, that brought it all down. By nightfall, the fake HOA was dissolved. Arrests were made, charges filed. And my mother? She was cleared publicly. She even got a visit from the sheriff himself, a personal apology, a commendation, and a quiet, respectful thank you for never backing down, even when no one else was watching. Later that week, Daniels returned, not on duty, just to check in. He stood at her porch, scratched Ranger behind the ears, and said, "I should have known. You were always 10 steps ahead of the game." My mom smiled, leaned back in her chair, and said, "They brought the wrong fight to the right woman." And that, right there, was the moment the power shifted, permanently. The moment the unmarked vehicles pulled up to the fake HOA office, the dusty old garage Karen had converted into her headquarters, you could feel the air shift. The doors opened in perfect coordination, boots hit the pavement, and without a word, the squad moved in. No sirens, no dramatic shouting, just calm, precise execution. They had warrants for everything: computers, ledgers, physical records, even her personal phone. Inside, under a shelf of dusty paint cans and fake community guidelines, they found what they were looking for: a fireproof lockbox labeled dues and fines. Inside, stacks of unreported cash and handwritten ledgers mapping out who had paid what and how much they were still owed. But the real bombshell came from the hard drives, encrypted files cataloging payments made by residents who weren't even legally under HOA jurisdiction. Some of them were elderly. One woman had paid over $3,000 in violation fines for things like her porch light being too dim or her garden hose not being coiled. Every name, every transaction was there. And right at the top of every spreadsheet, K. Warner, self-appointed HOA president. When Karen arrived on the scene, storming toward the garage in her designer sandals and oversized sunglasses, she didn't even get a word out. One of the officers stepped forward, read her the charges, and began reciting her rights: fraud, harassment, extortion, falsifying documents, impersonating a governing official. Her face drained of color. She spun, eyes darting toward the growing crowd of neighbors gathering across the street, phones out, mouths hanging open. People she had intimidated, fined, threatened for years were now watching her be placed in handcuffs. And then she saw my mother across the street, on her porch, in her chair, calm, unshaken. Ranger sitting tall at her side. Karen locked eyes with her, something desperate behind the glare. But my mother didn't flinch. She didn't need to say anything. Justice had finally spoken for her, and it spoke loud. Over the next 72 hours, it all came crashing down. Investigators uncovered records stretching back 2 years. Karen had created a shell HOA using an old name, rebranded it with forged documents, and mailed out dues notices that looked legitimate enough to scare people into compliance. She had even hired a local web designer to build a fake HOA website. All of it was a con, but the most shocking revelation? Karen had been keeping a portion of the collected dues in an offshore account. She wasn't just scamming people, she was laundering the money. My mother's refusal to bow, her decision to record, track, and document every visit, every note, every false claim, was the crack that shattered it all. And when it came time to file the official complaint, she rolled into the sheriff's department herself, quietly, dignified, and right beside her, Ranger in full K-9 vest, head held high. The officers inside stood up when she entered. She was handed a folder, thick with evidence, statements, and affidavits, and a pen. "You ready to sign this complaint?" Daniels asked. She gave a nod, placed her hand steadily on the table, and with Ranger's nose nudging gently at her elbow, signed her name in bold ink. That single signature set off a domino effect. Within a week, the HOA was legally dissolved. All residents who had paid dues or fines were contacted. Refunds were issued. Some people cried when they got their checks. One elderly man had been living on canned soup for months after being forced to pay nearly half his pension to avoid legal action. The neighborhood changed almost overnight. No more clipboard inspections, no more shady letters, no more chains on gates or passive-aggressive yard signs. Karen's house, seized and put on the market to help repay restitution. And my mother, she became something of a legend, not because she fought back, but because she did it with discipline, patience, and proof. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to confront. She just needed the truth and the right people to see it. A month later, a small ceremony was held by the local precinct. Quiet, humble, just how she liked it. They gave her a certificate of appreciation, a commemorative badge, and something she wasn't expecting. An official thank you plaque signed by every homeowner who had been scammed. One note handwritten on the back read, "Because of you, I got my dignity back." And perhaps the most poetic part of it all? As she stood beside the officer she once trained, looking out over a neighborhood finally at peace, Ranger let out a low bark, one bark, just loud enough to echo off Karen's now empty porch. It was like a punctuation mark to the entire ordeal. Justice wasn't just served, it stood, four paws planted, beside the woman who never gave up, even when every tactic was used to break her spirit. And from that day forward, no one on that street ever underestimated her again. My mom never wanted to be a hero. She just wanted a quiet life, a garden to tend, her service dog by her side, and the freedom she'd earned after decades of protecting others. But sometimes peace isn't given. Sometimes you have to fight for it. Now, she's a name people speak with respect in our neighborhood. The woman who stood tall in her wheelchair and dismantled a fake empire with nothing but truth and persistence. The HOA is gone. Her home is safe. Karen, let's just say she's no longer issuing citations, unless it's from a jail phone. But just when we thought the storm had passed, something else surfaced. During the investigation, buried deep in the HOA's files was a reference. Coded transactions, land transfers, and a location map that didn't match any known property lines. And one line scrawled across a margin, "Don't let them find the vault." We thought it was over. We were wrong. So if you thought this was wild, just wait until you hear what was hidden beneath our feet. Drop your wildest HOA story in the comments. Smash that like button and subscribe. Because part 2, it's going underground.